the first societies for the protection of animals. Among them, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, whose extremely outspoken members didn't hesitate to demonstrate in the streets against the slaughter of cormorants. Huge numbers of birds were killed to provide feathers for the clothing and hat industries. These feathers were mostly sourced in Europe, but for more exotic plumage, they looked to Africa. Animal supporters quickly became concerned with what fate had in store for wildlife in the colonies. Thanks to the pressure of public opinion, the hunting lobby, and those involved in animal defense, the government took a few steps in favor of African wildlife. Initially, it concerned elephants. From 1890, the English banned the killing of female elephants in herds. A few years later, they outlawed the importing of tusks under 20 pounds, which would protect younger animals, a ruling that was adopted jointly by 6 countries possessing African colonies. They gathered in London in 1900 to discuss the fate of animals in their colonies. It was the first time that a group of countries officially gathered around a table to discuss the protection of animals. It was the only good thing that came out of that conference. The rest of their findings were highly questionable. Notably, they decided to ban all forms of hunting in the colonies that was considered barbarous or cruel. In principle, very commendable. However, the text specified what was barbarous and what wasn't. The use of spears, arrows, traps or pits were considered barbarous. In other words, all the traditional forms of hunting used by Africans for millennia were now outlawed. In this way, the whites, who were essentially the only ones who owned shotguns, had reserved all the game for themselves. The conference decided to proceed for the first time with a classification of the African animals. There were 5 categories. The first category included species to be protected. Then, the further you went down the list, the worse the statutes got. When classifying each species, their population numbers were not taken into account, although these figures were relatively unknown. Instead, lawmakers were inspired by the interests of hunters and farmers. Zebras, giraffes and rhinos were fairly well classified. But so was the oxpecker, a commonplace bird that was classed in the good category simply because it ate ticks off animals. In other words, it was useful because it limited the propagation of parasites on livestock. As for the animals in the 5th category, they could be killed any time, in any way, and without limit. On this blacklist, it was no surprise to see crocodiles, lions, leopards, caracals and baboons, which in one way or another posed problems for European landowners. In any case, these highly bureaucratic regulations were obviously impossible to enforce. There was an often repeated adage that said, "The savannah is deaf and blind." In other words, deep in the bush there was no one to see what you did or to stop you from doing it. At the beginning of the 20th century, in German East Africa, a man fought to see that the regulations were respected. He was Governor Hermann von Wissmann. He relentlessly pursued those who killed chimps, elk or ostriches, because these were protected species. The governor explained his severity with these words: "We must think of future generations. We have to ensure that they will still be able to experience the great pleasure of hunting in Africa." Once again, the protection of wildlife was motivated by the concerns of hunters. Whatever the reason, the desire to preserve game would lead to a vital concept in animal protection: the creation of reserves. Protected sanctuaries where animals could escape slaughter and re-establish their numbers. If Tanzania can boast about its abundant wildlife today, it would no doubt be thanks to their early initiatives. On this map, you can see the number and size of the game reserves created in Tanganyika at the beginning of the 20th century. They pretty much correspond to Tanzania's parks and reserves today. The German Empire also had a colony in the south. In 1907, this part of southern Africa, which would later become Namibia, was still called German Southwest Africa. It was administered by Governor von Lindquist. He was the one who declared 30,000 square miles of this massive expanse a game reserve. It was simply called Reserve Number 2. At the time, it was the largest protected area in the world. Later, it would become Etosha National Park. At the beginning of the 20th century, Africa was crisscrossed by several scientist explorers who put their passion for hunting at the disposition of the great museums in search of specimens of exotic animals. Among them, Swiss naturalist Bernard de Watteville, who accompanied by his daughter Vivian, collected animals for the Bern Museum.